Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are around the planet. Welcome back to Creation Conversations with myself, Joe Hubbard, Indiana Joe. We've also got John Mackay with us today and Dr. Diane Eager. So hello again to you both. You've both been on the show before. And John, we know you on most weeks as well. So it's very good to see you.
And you too as well, although all we can see are two artifacts, I think, at the moment on our screen. So g'day, Joseph, and where did you get those sort of things, or are we seeing something the audience can't see?
It seems like you're seeing something the audience can't see because I'm pretty sure I took those pictures down. But this is the kind of thing that I was showing, which the audience should be able to see about now. Is the big brick that I'm holding. This is a brand new thing that we've just acquired at Creation Research. It's a wonderful cuneiform stamp. It's a big brick that would have been used in a big palace or a big building. It's Babylonian, so you've heard of Daniel and the Lion's Den and the Babylonians that marched into Jerusalem and sort of destroyed Jerusalem, took over Judah, and ended up taking the captives back, and they kept them in captivity until they got sent back to the promised land by the Persian kings. But this is a nice little reminder that you can trust the Bible because it's got this wonderful little cuneiform stamp on it. You see the nice little cuneiform there, or writing. I mean, cuneiform just really means wedge-shaped. It's been produced by these sort of wedge-shaped pencils that you stick into the wet clay, or has been stamped into the wet clay, and it's got some writing on it. Now, this particular brick came from an old collection. It was from a deceased pastor, reverend, who had them in his collection, and it was certified by the British Museum, very prestigious institute in the UK. And you can see the translation there. This is the official translation from the British Museum. It says there, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who provides for Esquila and Izida, the eldest son of Napalasa, king of Babylon, am I. And that little interesting bit, am I, at the bottom is very important because it shows that this is the king physically saying this. It's him in his own word. It's in first person. He's saying, I am the king of Babylon am I. This is who I am, which is exactly what we read in the book of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar's prayer to God, recognizing the Lord God Jehovah for who he is. He refers to himself in the first person. And for many years, most of these bricks didn't have the first person from Nebuchadnezzar there. It was sort of penned by his scribes or stamped by his scribes. So it's a good reminder that this is exactly exactly the kind of prose that we read in the Bible, which is also very, very important. I'll just put it back like that. Hopefully you guys can see yourselves in the screen.
We can see ourselves now, Joseph. Can we make a comment on your brick that we?
Of course you can. Yeah, go for
which is really interesting. There's a real interest in antiquities at the moment, but of course there's also the scandal of one of the big American Christian groups that got caught out with not fake stuff but real stuff that was illegally imported.
Oh yes,
The troops went right. So just to comment that this meets all the CITES regulations. It meets all of the legalities. This is certified as a genuine, property we can have in England. And the translation was done by the British History Museum. So it is absolutely in accordance with, hey, the Bible says this, and look what Nebuchadnezzar said as well. And it's out of Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar has a letter recorded in Aramaic, which they still speak in northern Iran and Iraq today. But it's fabulous stuff. So well done, Joseph, and may we see many more Nebuchadnezzar signatures.
And praise the Lord for providing it for us, because this is a fabulous piece that is it's virtually impossible to get now, because during the Gulf Wars, there was so much smuggling that was going on with these cuneiform tablets. And what's now happening, because they've suddenly become really, really popular, people are having to go through them with a fine-tooth comb. And there was a huge archive which got shipped back to Iraq and Iran because it had been smuggled out of there during the Gulf Wars and stuff like this. But this bit is wonderful because it has that provenance with it. It sort of was collected way back in the sort of early 1900s, late 1800s. The guy who actually collected it, who was in his collection, even wrote a book about his travels. And these were the days where you could go and collect whatever you wanted and bring it back. And that fact that it's been certified by the British Museum is really great. So praise the Lord, brand new addition to our museums project project there. One other thing that I'll just quickly put up while we're sort of getting into this, a couple of pictures now. I know you remember, John, because I sort of rang you up and chatted to you when I first went there. But a few years back now, in 2016, I think it was, which is a whole 5 years ago, which seems to have gone very, very quickly. I was on holiday with my family at a place called Wheelie Bridge, and we found some fabulous stalactites, and I took photos, and we wrote about them, and they're published in Tights, Mites, and Fossil Fights, and you can buy that wonderful research book from creationresearch.net. But I went back there yesterday, and it's coming along very nicely. Look at that.
What's that out of, Joseph?
So that's coming out of one of the drainage pipes that comes down from the top of the railway tracks. It sort of collects all of the gunge and the sludge and the decaying leaves and everything and flushes it all down with the rainwater into the stream below. But out of it is growing this rather fabulous and very, very thick stalactite. But I think it was interesting for a couple of reasons. And one of the reasons it was interesting when we first found it, other than the obvious fact that the bridge is only about 160 odd years old, or 155 years old. So it's about a process, not time. It can grow really quickly. But this was exactly the same time that you were doing a load of research over in Australia about mulch and ooze and gunge and how that sort of affects stalactite growth as well.
It certainly is true. And for those of you who haven't caught up on any of our research, again, Joseph mentioned tights, mites, and stalactites, and you'll see all this in that book. And it is available from creationresearch.net. Just click bookshop or any of those. But the key thing that's interesting is when we heard what you'd found, Joseph, we thought, I wonder if we can duplicate that and how long would it take? Now, two things. It comes from the concrete out of an old brick, right? And so people say, oh, it's not real limestone. Well, we spent several years testing that's exactly what it was. And here's an interesting factor. Even when you pour cement powder out of a bag, it reacts with the CO2 in the air and turns back to limestone, right? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's a process that happens like that, right? So you'll find that the concrete absorbs the CO2 and becomes calcium carbonate, and from there on it behaves as limestone. We've done that over and over again. But what we also did was we were growing stalactites and stalagmites, and what we noticed was the leaves would blow in. And we, of course, did our best to clean them out until you found this. And then we thought, how long does it take for a leaf to get stuck in a pile of limestone stalagmite? And the answer was in between windbreaks. Right? The wind blows, the leaf comes in. By the next breath, the leaf is stuck, and it's instant. We have one leaf at the moment hanging on a stalactite. It obviously blew up against the stalactite, and it's stuck.
It's remarkable. Here's some of the new ones that were forming since the last time I was there. I mean, these are rock solid. In fact, you can sort of snap them in two. They're no longer just sort of covered. They've been fully impregnated with this calcium carbonate, with limestone. It is, by all technical definitions, a fossil. You could call it petrification, you could call it permineralization, whatever you like. But the reality is the process, and that's the key word here, process, which is fossilizing these leaves, is exactly the same process that fossilizes dinosaur bones, because they're permineralized as well. And a lot of times skeptics say, oh, well, they're not real fossils, they're just permineralized or covered or partially thing. Well, the reality is that's exactly the same process that is happening with dinosaur bones. The only difference in the secular version's eyes is that dinosaur bones are supposed to be 65 million plus years old, whereas these could never possibly be fossils because, well, according to the secular definition, fossils have to be older than 10,000 years, which is only there, that date is only there in order to get rid of any biblical history. But here we have wonderful evidence that it's all about the process. It's got nothing to do with time in the slightest. Well, the reason why we're doing this again, and the reason why Diane is here, is because last week we started on a question which had been given to you, John, by a teacher, I believe, and we started discussing it. But last week we were on a rather controversial topic, and that took up the bulk of the time. So we thought it'd be a good idea to come back, revisit that question, and to sort of run through it again. Now, I've got the question up here. This was the question we used last week. It says, "What about structural adaptation on being forced to teach this in primary school?" That's sort of the summary. John, do you want to give us a bit more detail about where this question came from and who was sort of asking it and why they needed to know?
Right. Okay. A, it is a primary school teacher. B, obviously a Christian. C, someone who's not into biology, but just suspects there's something wrong with the whole syllabus that says structural adaptation is a proof of evolution, teacher to the kids. Now, this is for year 4, right? This is for elementary students. This is for young kids who, I mean, the example in the textbook was a camel. Now, they've all seen camels on television. I'll guarantee none of them have read them. Hardly any of them will have smelt them, and let alone, you know, got up close and touched them. But, you know, they have their humps. They've evolved a hump in order to survive in the desert. Now, many Christians would say, oh no, God gave them a hump to survive in the desert. Now, both of those things are actually really tinged with a whole lot of error. So let me sort of help you what the real situation is. We gave you a brief summary of this. I'm here today. Dr. Diane Eager is up in the office from Canberra. So welcome, Diane. Good to have you up here. And what we'll find is that we need a biblical perspective. This teacher was a Christian, said, I can't teach what I don't believe in. I don't know if I believe this or not. Okay, so point number 1, God made everything. Point number 2, God made everything very good. That's your starting point. Any of you are into biology, whether you're worried about sharks' teeth or lions or bears, why they're black and they're white in the Arctic, all those sort of things, you've got to start here. God made everything very good. There was no summer, there was no winter, even the weather is spectacular. And so what you find is what God made the camel for is to survive in a beautiful world. Mm-hmm. Now, its hump actually doesn't store water. It's not like 2 big water barrels on the back that sort of are
shaking. That's what I grew up thinking, that it was like 2 just, you know, big water barrels just sitting there that he could sort of suck from any time he wanted.
I'm afraid that's what's in most people's mind because of the way they've been taught it at school. Yeah. Or the way David Attenborough will say, isn't evolution marvelous? It's made the camel like this. And the reality is they are food storage, which all of us have. Some of you have a lot more around your belly than you should have. But we store food, and the camel stores food in its back, and it uses it as it's going along. So it's a portable tuck shop, as it were, from a school analogy. But when you convert that food, that fat back to food, water is one of the byproducts. Now, God made the camel with good supply of food store, and because deserts came later, well after the flood, in fact. The flood is rain, first rain in history, but before that, the world was very good, no deserts. So God did not make the camel for the deserts. There was none. After Noah's flood, heat and drought. You see Abraham recorded with a big drought, and the Bible says he owned lots of camels, lots of sheep, right? He was very wealthy. Camels are important in the desert, and they could survive in the desert because they already had a feature that would enable them to go a long time without food, and at the same time as it was using up its food supply, it would get a free drink of water with every internal mouthful. That's a good way of looking at it, isn't it, Diane? So the teacher was very happy, and they'd never ever thought of saying, hey, let's start with God's view of things. Let's start with a biblical picture. And that was our revision from last week, Joseph. So where do we want to go from there?
Well, really, it's interesting because really the thing which is going on here, the reality of it is almost the opposite of what they're really claiming. I mean, they're claiming that, you know, structural adaptation, these creatures adapted or evolved in order to be able to cope with a certain environment, and that's why, you know, you only have koalas in Australia, and that's why you have camels in the desert, and that's why you have penguins in the Antarctic. Whereas the reality is almost completely the opposite. It's not that they adapted to be able to survive or came up with new features or evolved new features in order to survive in a new climate. They're the ones which were able to survive there and everything else wasn't. And so everything else died off. Natural selection is a very real thing. It just means that creatures that can't survive die. And so you actually end up with a very select, it's almost like a selection of creatures. Only the creatures that are able to survive in a certain area end up surviving there. They didn't actually evolve for that specific environment.
I think the word they use is natural selection. Yeah, it's true. Diane, you came across a good example recently. We have lots of snakes around the office here, right? Good way to keep visiting salesmen and all that out is just put a sign saying snakes aboard. And it dealt with snakes and the adaptation of their fangs. You want to tell everybody about that?
Yes, if any of you get our newsletter, we wrote about this. This was a study that was published where scientists decided snakes adapted their fangs according to their food, And what they did is they looked at venomous snakes, looked at their fangs. Now, snake fangs are not all the same. Some snakes have fangs right at the front of their mouths, and they tend to be long and thin and sharp. And there are other snakes that have blunt teeth, and they actually have fangs that are about halfway back in their mouths, and they tend to be sort of shorter and blunter. And they worked out, well, the snakes that have these long, thin fangs that are very sharp, they tend to eat things like mice and small mammals with soft skin, because the fangs are like needles. They'll easily penetrate their skin. Whereas these more blunt-toothed snakes, they could eat things with tougher skins like scaly reptiles and even crabs. And so they decided, well, the snakes have adapted their fangs according to their food. Now, it's actually the other way around.
Yeah.
All they have discovered is that snakes will eat whatever they can. So if a snake has long, thin, sharp teeth and it tried to crunch on a crab, well, it would just break its teeth. So that wouldn't work.
And it would die. That would be the end
and
of
it would
snake.
die. That's right. And the rear-fanged snakes, which tend to have more blunt teeth, if they tried to catch a mouse, well, the mouse would escape before it would be able to inject it with venom. So it would go hungry as well. So all they've found is that snakes can eat whatever they can. Now, if you put that into the biblical perspective, well, in the beginning, nothing ate other animals. All animals were meant to eat plants. But after the flood, the environment degenerated very rapidly. People were given permission to eat meat, so animals would have just survived on whatever they can. They would have followed suit. So snakes would go looking for protein food. Animals seem to know when they need protein. If they can't get it from plants, they will get it from animals, and they will use whatever resources they have got to get their food. Animals are designed to survive. So survival of the fittest is real, but it's actually a design process. It's actually a forward planning process. So nothing has adapted here. This is typical misuse of the language, but by the evolution. Adaptation is a real process, and it does form some structural changes, but not the sort of changes that are implied by the title of that snake article, where it says that the snakes adapted their teeth according to their food. No, they chose their food according to whatever teeth they already had.
But Diane, just two things. You do a lot of providing of those research articles for the Evidence News every week or two, don't you? And if folks want to keep up with this sort of research, with the original research, plus our commentary, wearing God's glasses, we like to say, so you can see things God's way, that's available. Go to our website, click on subscribe, and you can receive that absolutely free. And that's a good price. That's a very good price. But there's two questions that I can see. If God made the creatures very good, the snakes that have venom, right? What was the venom for?
Well, actually, the evolutionists have worked that out as well. They work out lots of things.
They do a lot of our work for us, don't they?
That's right. So that's why we can use all of them. We just trawl the normal scientific news and see what's being discovered. But anyway, going back to snake venom. Snake venom has lots of chemical components, but a lot of them are to do with digestion. They're digestive enzymes, which actually break down living tissue, break down cellular tissue and fibrous tissue and other things like that. So that's why if it is injected into you, it's very painful and it damages your tissue. That's what it's designed for, but it's designed to be used on things that are meant to be eaten. Snakes don't chew their food. They just inject their food with venom and then they swallow it. And the venom is sort of like an internal injection of digestive enzymes, so that if you're going to swallow your food whole in a great big bulk, the enzymes have to penetrate into it. So it's part of the snake's digestive processes. So there's nothing intrinsically evil about that.
No.
Now, Joseph, out here in our backyard, I've got pythons that are up to 15 feet or 5 meters long, right? Now, I'm not worried about them. They're friendly sort of things. They will sort of strangle you if they get you in the wrong place. But I was in England one year on a field trip up near Manchester and on the beach, and someone yelled, "Snake!" Now, I looked everywhere for this snake, and all I could find was a worm. Now, do you have any poison? That's exactly. Do you have any poisonous snakes in England at all?
We have one species of venomous snake. We only have 3 species of snake in the UK, and the our venomous one is a type of viper. It's called the adder. In the UK, but I mean, it's what's really interesting when it comes to sort of all the venom and stuff like that is coming because I come from a zookeeping background, as you know, and one of the big surprising things for me was finding out that there were 100% vegetarian reptiles which are venomous, which have mild forms of rattlesnake venom with fully formed venom sacs and injector hoses, you could call them, things that specifically are designed to inject venom into a substance. And I mean, like the green iguana, for instance, great big lizard from sort of Central and North South America, or the bearded dragon from Australia. It's just sort of adult bearded dragons are sort of 60 to 80% vegetarian, and the meat that they eat is mostly things like worms and bugs and crickets and grubs and stuff, and it's certainly nothing that they would need to, or you would view it as needing to have venom in order to hunt. And they certainly don't use venom in the same way that we see some of your very venomous snakes using it. But it just turns out, just as Diane said, the venom is a digesting fluid. It is designed to digest, to pre-digest things which enable it to be eaten. So you've got a lizard which lives in the fairly arid places in Australia. It will use its mild venom, which is, I say it's mild. It's relatively harmless to humans, but it would quite easily kill a small mammal if it was used. But we've never documented any bearded dragon eating a small mammal, even though it's got this sort of potent venom in it. It uses it for the plants to pre-digest the hard to digest plants as it swallows it down. Same for the green iguanas as well. And I've been bitten by a green iguana, so I know for sure how painful that can be and how it can swell up and everything from that venom.
Just really what we're getting to is when we're dealing with the subject of adaptation, it's an inbuilt ability from the time of creation, which at creation would have been used for the right purposes. And as the world's gone downhill, it can now be used for alternative purposes, whether the camel doesn't even know it's doing this, and therefore it can adapt to survive in the desert. It can suit the desert even before the desert exists. Or the venom in the rattlesnake can be used after it ceases to be vegetarian, right? And it can actually still be used because it's injected into the creature, just as it would have been injected into a big watermelon or whatever rattlesnakes used to eat. And I've got one. Diane and I were talking about this program before we did it, and I've got a couple of examples I love to use that refer to human beings on adaptation. My favorite one struck me because out here the big talk is, will Australia win the next Olympic, are we going to be granted the Olympic Games? So it's all a big issue out here. And it struck me that, okay, I remember when we sent our Aussie athletes to Mexico City Olympics. And the thing that was interesting is it cost us an awful lot more to go to those Olympics because we had to send them 6 months earlier, because Mexico City is a mile high sort of city and the air is a lot thinner. So they had to go there, and the words that were used is their lungs had to adapt to the lower oxygen percentage of the high air. Now, we already knew that people can do this, right? Normally down at sea level, you have normal atmospheric pressure. Your lungs and your whole body is suited to that. But all of a sudden, you find if you climb a mountain, your lungs will adjust to increase the oxygen absorption as the air pressure gets lower and lower. Of course, if you were to do it straight away, you'd faint, right? You just can't be thrown into a mile high above the earth and expect to get used to it. But what's interesting is the athletes made it, they set records, etc. Then they had to readjust coming down the hill. But here's the thing that struck me. If we ever hold the Olympic Games at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, can we adapt to the lower oxygen content 1 mile below the surface of the water? And the answer is no. We've got 3 minutes, right? If you can't evolve an adaptation in 3 minutes underwater, you're not going to make it, right? So you don't have that ability, therefore you can't do it. So that's the first example. Adaptation is an inbuilt ability. It is not something you can evolve because you don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
You have to have it in order to survive, or you won't. Now, Joseph, my name is Mackay. Where do I come from?
Scotland, of course.
Scotland.
Yeah.
And your name is?
Hubbard.
Hubbard. And what part of the country are you from?
Sort of northeastern area.
Northeast, right. Now, the English people have a history right for the last 1,000 years or so of trying to conquer Scotland, right?
Yeah.
And even the Romans tried to conquer Scotland, and we built a big wall across there to keep them out. No, I think it was the other way around. But I remember talking to my dad once, because my family comes from way up north in Scotland, right? And I said, now, why do we actually live right on the coast? You almost have to see the Arctic is the next stop. And he said, that's as far as we could go, because the English wouldn't chase us that far. Right? Now, the interesting thing about Scottish people that most people don't know is we have the thickest sole feet of every race on the planet. Now, we had them before we went to Scotland, and anybody who didn't, because we used to run around barefooted on those cold, icy rocks, right? If you didn't have thick sole feet, you died out. The English caught you. They put you into prison. This is not a political discussion about Scottish land rights or anything like that, right? But in reality, it's a brilliant example that if you already have a genetic ability to have thick feet, then you will survive that. The ones who have thin feet won't. And it struck me too, when I was doing genetics at university, we discussed the use of sprays on fruit flies. And the theory was Australian flies have evolved to resist sprays and insecticide. You know those ones you spray on the surfaces? And my professor said, no, Aussie flies simply get away with walking all over that because they're thick. They've got thick feet, right? And the poison just can't soak through into their feet. So you've either got it or the spray kills you in a couple of minutes. So again, a good example, adaptation is not something you get by slow exposure. You've either got it or you die out.
Well, before we move on, it's just interesting you mentioned the word race in there, John, in talking about the Scottish race. We're actually dealing with that topic a little bit later on today, tonight, whatever time it is around the world, aren't we?
Yes, in about an hour and a half, I believe.
Something like that. Yeah, we will be over at the Standing for Truth website with Donnie over there and with George. So do come and join us. It's just Standing for Truth. Stick it into YouTube. You'll find us. And that's going on in an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. Let's just cycle back a little bit and talk about one more thing when it comes to adaptation and the like, because it's interesting if you delve into the history of evolution. It's not a new idea in the slightest. You know, the Greeks had an idea. The Babylonians and the Hindus had an idea of very deep time, bringing it forward, and you had the French revolutionaries who were trying to get rid of the authority of the kings by denying, it came from God, and so on and so forth. And this whole evolution story sort of woven throughout history. But it really all kicked off when you had Charles Lyell, who sort of wanted to push forward the agenda of the present is the key to the past, uniformitarianism. You end up with giving Charles Darwin his copy of books. They go on the famous HMS Beagle trip, and even though this sort of idea of evolution had been long in the works, in the sort of public side today, it's kind of credited to Charles Darwin as sort of the revolutionary thinker behind evolution. And if you read his book on the origin of species, or even if you don't, if you've just heard about stuff and you've just sort of, heard about stuff in the media and David Attenborough and the like, the one piece of evidence you would almost always come up with is these finches on the Galapagos Island, which are supposed to have evolved in order, and that's where Charles Darwin got his idea of, the big finches are living here and they can eat the big seeds, and the thin-beaked finches are living here and they can eat the little seeds, and oh wow, they've evolved to their own sort of, biome, they've evolved to their own sort of environment. Is basically what we've been talking about tonight. Is that what's really going on here? Did Darwin fundamentally misunderstand or misinterpret, whether willingly or not, the evidence that he was looking at when it came to these finches?
Diane?
Well, this is a classic example of where the evolutionists have hijacked a real word about a real process. Now, going back to the finches, we've written about these a fair bit in our newsletter. So if you go to our fact file, so just look up creation research fact file. We archive all the individual science reports we put there, so you can just do a keyword search for a particular topic. Look up Darwin's finches. The interesting thing is they are presented as being 12 or 13 separate species, but recent genetics has actually shown they do interbreed, so they're just one kind of finch. But going to their beaks, that is a classic example of survival of the fittest and natural selection, and it is called adaptation, but again, it's not. The ones that arrived on islands where there were only big, thick seeds to eat, if you had a big, thick beak, well, you could eat those. If you didn't, you died out. So that generation survived, and they've passed on those genes to the 4 big, thick beaks. And we know how that works as well. They've worked out the genetics for the different size beaks in terms of their thickness and their robustness. And all of the finches have the genes for beaks, of course, but there are variations in beak thickness and beak width, just like there are variations in human beings for eye color and hair color and things like that. So again, survival of the fittest, a real process, but it's not adaptation. Adaptation is the ability to just adjust to small changes in the environment. It's a design feature. It's there to enable things to survive, because the environment is never absolutely the same unless you live indoors in an air-conditioned environment and never poke your nose out into the real world. But out in the real world, the temperature changes, the wind changes, the humidity changes, and all of those sorts of things. So we are designed to adjust to that, and so are animals and plants and birds. But they will not grow new structures. So we were talking about the athletes going to the Olympic Games. There was a limit to how much they could adjust. And what happens is that you make more blood cells, as well as your heart and your lungs adjust to the extra load of having to pump your blood, more blood around your body and more blood cells around your body to distribute the oxygen. But being up there is not, you're not going to grow any new lungs. And the same as if we bury you underwater, you're not going to suddenly develop gills. So adaptation is a real process that enables you to cope with small changes in the environment, which are part of the natural cycles of the real world. It is not going to build new structures or new functions. Unless you already have those, you will not survive. So survival of the fittest is real. The struggle for life is real, because we live in a world that has been corrupted. But adaptation is a real process, but it's not an evolutionary process. And this is where the evolutionists have just hijacked that word. And Charles Darwin was the one who started that off by using that word for what he meant were structural and functional changes that go beyond just variation within your own life cycle.
Just a bit of history there, because our time is sort of starting to get short. You'll find the word adapt used before Charles Darwin, but it was always used in a biblical creation sense, because that was the mindset of the scientists, the philosophers, etc., by and large. So you could change your vegetables from one field to another, and even they could adapt if they had the ability. You bring English fruits to Australia, they don't adapt too well, right? So you'll find that the ability of adaptation is a God-given gift. It has limits, right? And in a world that's gone from good to bad to now, you will find that some creatures have died out because they have not been able to survive the transition. The evolution doesn't help them one bit. If they have that God-given gift and it fits within the limits of the change, they will survive. Otherwise, they bomb out. So the best and most important part of this issue is get a biblical worldview, and that will help you with camels, with snakes, with lions, with tigers, with why the bears are white in the Arctic, right? All of those things that will give you a God set of glasses to see things the right way.
Excellent. Well, like you say, we have sort of done our half an hour that we normally try and stick it to. It was one question I was going to ask, and you can either answer it very briefly or say leave it, and we'll do a whole other creation conversations on it. Because one term that has been used a lot, I mean, we've dealt with adaptation and structural adaptation and stuff, but over and over again we keep hearing this word design. Camels are designed to do this, or are they designed to do that, or creatures are designed to adapt, or so on and so forth. How would you actually recognize design if well, what is your definition? What is the definition of design? How would you recognize whether something has been designed or whether it has simply evolved? Or is that too big a thing to answer in just a couple of minutes?
It's too big a thing to give a whole answer. I'll just give a tiny one that you will find. Many people like to say intelligent design is the evidence that life has been created, and there's a truth in that. But you will find that it's also the evidence that a matchstick has been created, right? Because no matchstick on the planet ever got here all by itself, right? So we actually get bits of pine and we shape it into a square shape, elongate, put some phosphorus mixture on the end, etc. And we use this evidence. The end result has got properties that don't come from the stuff it's made of. So that wood plus phosphorus never combine all by themselves to make matches at all. So therefore the end product does things that the individual bits could not do. Now this can be applied in a very broad sense to a sponge cake that mum makes, right? To a motor car, to an aeroplane, or to you and I, where God took dust that doesn't do people and turned it into a man. Now man can do people into dust, right? We kill people. We can do that, but we just can't do it the other way, right?
Around, yeah.
If we ever do, it'll prove you needed somebody intelligent in the first place. So yes, you can recognize design, but I really do think you should. What do you reckon? Do I do a whole program on that? That's a really good.
That's a big topic. Okay, well, excellent. Thank you very much. It's been really good tonight. It's absolutely flown by, and we're sort of getting on for 10 minutes over time, but that really doesn't matter. Do join us for Standing for Truth. We will be dealing with that icky, tricky subject of race. How many races are there? Is it just one? Is it many? Where did the term race come from? Is it purely just a political thing, which is often what's claimed today by many people, is that race is just a political makeup. So we're going to be dealing with that topic. It should be really fun over on the Standing for Truth website. So or YouTube channel, sorry. So do join us over there. Standing for Truth into YouTube. You'll find us, no problem at all. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for those people who are watching. Goodbye, God bless, and we will see you next week for another Creation Conversations. See you later.
Yes.
Bye.
Goodbye.